We're going to be hearing from Jackie Harris this evening, who is with us from the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, Slimbridge. I hope I said that correctly. And she's going to talk about kind of restoration and conservation of wetlands and the crucial part that they play in our fight against the effects of climate change. If anybody hasn't noticed it on the way in, we've got a collection bucket. So if anyone happens to have a bit of spare change in their pocket, please do drop it in there on the way out. It all goes to WWT Slimbridge, nowhere else. So yeah, we're collecting money for them tonight. And yeah, I'm going to hand over to Jackie. Thanks, Jackie.
Thanks very much. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for inviting me along. I suppose before I start, it's worth giving just a little bit of introduction to me. So I've been at the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust since April 2016. I went there with the idea that I would stay for 15 months maximum. It's now a little bit longer than that. And I went there to work on a Heritage Lottery Fund project. So those of you who play the lottery, thank you very much, because we got just over £4 million. And from that, we did a lot of work at Slimbridge, building new exhibits that tell the story of the importance of watery habitats, the creatures that live in them, the people who rely on those, and also the story of our founder, Sir Peter Scott. I said I was going to stay for 15 months. I actually stayed on to do the build. So I stayed on for another 4 years after that. You'll remember that COVID got in the way and stalled things a little bit. But I continue to work there because I'm a volunteer there. So tonight I'm a volunteer for the Trust because it is the single most amazing organisation I've ever worked for or volunteered for. And I've always volunteered pretty much wherever I work. So this is a very, very special place for all kinds of reasons, for the work it does in wetlands, for the work it does to restore wetlands and the creatures that rely on them. But tonight, this is new territory for me. I'm going to talk you through blue recovery. So what's blue recovery? So I'm hoping as we go through my talk this evening, you're going to get to understand what this is and the role that wetlands can play in addressing some of the world's most critical problems. But before I do that, I just wanted to say a little bit about who we are really, a brief introduction to WWT. So what we do at WWT is we restore and create wetlands. That's probably no big surprise. We protect endangered species and their habitats. That's really important. It's really important to emphasize that. We've worked with some of the most, in fact, absolutely some of the rarest wetland species in the world. We have worked to restore species that have been declared extinct twice, in the case of Madagascar pochard. Peter Scott restored the nene to Hawaii. There are only 30 individuals left in the world. But what we don't do is work to restore species without restoring the place that they can live in the wild. And I think that's really important to state. What we don't do is arc. And what I mean by that is, let's go and see that dodo in the zoo, which we'll never ever be able to see in the wild. And maybe sometime in a not too distant future, that will be the horrible reality of reinstating from genetic material some of the species we've lost. But we would never do that. We would only do that if we could restore Mauritius for the dodo to live on. So that's what we do. We work with species on the places they live in. And the other thing is we inspire communities to get involved, not only in the work that we do, but in the wetlands in their own areas, because we know how important wetlands are, not just for the wildlife that lives there, but for our mental and physical health as well. So we want people to engage with their wetlands. And we want people to understand exactly what wetlands do for us. So that's the sort of our big banner thing, I suppose, really. But we're the UK's leading conservation charity around wetlands. We've got 10 sites in the UK. Everybody remembers Slimbridge, but we've got sites all over the UK. And we've got one that I'm going to talk about specifically a little bit later on, which is our site at Steart. That's on the north Somerset coast, sort of south of the Severn Estuary. It's a really important project there that opened in 2014, and from that we've been learning an awful lot about the subject I'm talking about tonight, which is blue recovery. We're a global leader in what we do, and what I mean by that is we carry some incredibly important authority because we are a research organisation, an education organisation, a conservation organisation. All of those things require us to do research. And if you see us anywhere in the press or news or whatever, what you'll see is we're not a very, very vocal organisation, although I think that is starting to change. What we are is we're solidly confident in our data and getting those messages across. And because of that, we're very, very well respected at home and across the world. We're one of 6 organisations that make up the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. We're saying a little bit about that. Ramsar is a city in Iran. In 1971, the Ramsar Wetlands Convention was signed in Iran. That convention was something that was instigated at WWT Slimbridge when Peter Scott was still with us. And essentially, when it was signed in Iran in 1971, so this is 52 years ago now, the idea was that countries would come together to protect the important wetlands around the world. There's now around 2,500 Ramsar sites around the world. There were 142 countries signed up to it initially. I think there's 172 now. And you can think about it, I suppose, as a bit like the UNESCO World Heritage Sites. This is the equivalent for wetlands. So we're talking about wetlands that are incredibly important on an international level. And you won't be surprised to know that we have a number of those sites within our 10 sites in the UK. And then the last one is we're working on this blue recovery, climate disaster, biodiversity programme to try and address some of the big issues that are affecting us at the moment. What we want to do is put wetlands at the heart of some of the big problems that we're addressing worldwide. So blue recovery, what on earth does that mean? It's a piece of jargon, isn't it? So I'm going to start with, over to you actually. So if I say wetlands, what does that mean to you? Hans, who wants to give a shout out? What do you think of if I say wetlands? It's already tricky, yeah.
Somewhere very boggy.
Boggy? Yeah, boggy is definitely one of them.
Ponds.
Ponds.
Estuaries.
Estuaries. Reed beds, definitely. It becomes difficult, doesn't it? So we're talking about marshes, bogs, streams, paddy fields, very human-created wetlands, seasonal wet patches, streams, pools, puddles, big puddles, areas where land meets the sea but where there's some fresh water involvement. So it's not like if I say glacier, you'll get an idea. If I say desert, rainforest, you know, we all have an idea of what that looks like. It is trickier with wetlands, but essentially wetlands are all those blue places where there's water either all the time or seasonally. And surprisingly, they make up just 1% of the world's habitats broadly. But 40% of all species rely on them, totally. So none of us can rely without fresh water. So I'm talking very specifically about areas of fresh water, including estuaries which have got this sort of saline mix, not talking about oceans here. So across the whole world, we've got about 3% of the water on the planet is fresh water. 1% of that is basically too far underground for us to access. 1% of it has been pretty much trashed by pollution and other human activity. And 1% is still usable. And that 1%, 40% of everything on Earth relies on it entirely for its existence. So it's pretty important. The other thing to say about wetlands is that we've lost 90% of it worldwide, and that's over the last roughly 500 years, but that's accelerated massively in the last 50 years. So if I say to you that we've lost 1/3 of UK wetlands in the last 50 years, you'll understand that this is not only an important habitat, but one that's under incredibly huge pressure. And we can't live without it. It's such a, we've caught ourselves in this real dilemma of destroying the thing that we can't live without. So blue recovery is really thinking about our current situation, which is, we've got, if you look at the diagram, I'm not asking you to think about the equation on there, but essentially we're looking at a world where the ability of the world to top up its sort of freshwater habitats is much greater than our ability or desire to drain it down. So what you can see is essentially our ecological footprint means that we are utterly destroying the very habitat that lots of things on Earth depend upon. And there's three kind of issues around the current problem, really. One is we've got a climate problem, we've got a nature depletion problem, and we've got a well-being crisis. So from climate, you'll all know, and that's why you're here, because this is part of the reason you're here tonight, is we absolutely know, don't we, that climate change is probably the most critical issue affecting not just humankind, but Earthkind. The whole well-being of our planet is being deeply affected by climate change. And that doesn't mean that we can't do things about that. The government has set targets for that, and in fact we have a national government commitment to not increase the amount of carbon in our atmosphere over the next from 2050, but we're going to miss our targets for this year, and we already know we're almost certainly going to miss our targets for 2032. So whilst there's a commitment at national government level to reduce our carbon footprint, we are not achieving that, and a large part of that is because of greenhouse gases from actually home heating. Is a lot of that gas heating at home. But if we can't reduce the amount that goes into the atmosphere, we have to find a way to suck it back out. And that's where wetlands come in. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on. And then we've got a nature crisis. You will all know that, you will remember, I know, times when you could go out into the countryside and see lots of bugs, lots of birds, lots of plants, lots of variation. And now we know that we don't see the things we used to see. It's interesting because I ride a motorcycle, and when I started riding my motorcycle in 2001, when I went out for the day on my bike, I would have to clean my visor for insects about every 3 hours. Now I can ride for 3.5 weeks before I have to clean my visor. Now that is not a scientific statement about the lack of insect life, but it is absolutely something that I feel and recognise. I don't see glowworms anymore. I don't see so many butterflies. And you will all have experienced this as well. And of course, it's the small stuff that feeds everything else up the food chain. So as we lose things, the small things, much of which we have never even identified. We think we're great at knowing what's around in the world. With most of these things, we have never even specifically identified what species there are. So we don't know that we're even losing them. We don't know what we've lost. And then the other thing is, and I guess that COVID was a big part of pointing this out to us, is the well-being crisis. Being trapped indoors where we weren't allowed to go out, suddenly there was this real realisation for many of us that being outside is an important part of staying mentally well, not just physically well, which we kind of think about getting exercise, but mentally and emotionally well. And I contend, and again, this is not me offering you science, it's me offering you observation really, is that if I walk across a field with some friends, we'll walk across a field, but if there's a pond in that field, there is something about a pond that is magnetic. We want to go to it because it's reflective. It's a bit like a bonfire. Yeah, it's got reflections, it's got different life in it. There's always something skimming around or buzzing around or different plant light. It's almost draws us on a sort of subliminal level, but that's the power of wetlands for our health as well. Natural capital depletion. That's real terminology, but I'm going to explain what I mean by that. So at the moment, the government is talking a great deal about the value of natural capital. And natural capital is basically everything that's in an area which is perfectly natural, either landscapes or habitats or wildlife or plant life, all that natural stuff. And that has an incredible value. And government is now working much harder on environmental issues, although I'm not going to get political here, but obviously there are lots of arguments to say they're not working very hard at all and money keeps being promised and diverted. There's all those arguments, but at least we now have a government strategy to try and do something about the environment, which we haven't really had before. But what the government is saying is that they recognise, and their own advisors are saying, we recognise that every pound spent on improving our natural capital, so improving habitats, is probably going to save us £9 in problems down the line. Now that is actually a better return on investment than most other capital. So when I talk about other capital, I'm talking about where we use our natural resources and either do something to it or work on it to change it into something else. Chairs, this room, industry, that, everything else, it all comes from nature ultimately, and then we change it into something else. But actually we have to have the natural stuff in the first place, otherwise there's nothing to work with. And then the other thing I've got up there is public demand. Where we are at now is, I joined Greenpeace, I suppose, I think it was the first time I joined Greenpeace was about 1985, and suddenly got in a panic about the world was nearly at an end. But actually, I definitely felt like I was in a minority then. I don't feel like I'm in a minority now. The very fact that you've all turned out from a relatively small village in the Cotswolds with a rainy night in September to listen to me talk about this stuff is an indicator of the fact that we are all getting concerned about the state of our environment and want to see something change. And that means now is the right time to take action. So where are we at the moment? So we've got this 25-year environment plan. It was launched in 2018, actually at London Wetlands Centre. And in it, the government is basically saying that after 25 years, we want to leave the state of the environment in the UK in a better state than it was in 2018. That's it in a nutshell, really. It's a really long strategy, but that's what it wants to do, is not leave anything in a worse state and actually to recover our green and blue spaces in order to leave the environment in a better state than it was when this strategy came out in 2018. And how does it do that? Well, there's a number of strands to it. One is nature recovery networks. It's a lot of jargon, but what that means really is trying to build networks where we improve habitats so that nature can move around. We used to talk about green corridors when I was working with Gordon McGlone years ago at the Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust. And they set up their first biodiversity plans back in the early 90s, I think it was. And that was what we were talking about, as green corridors, but we're actually talking about networks where species can move around and start to flourish. But those networks are important for us as well. It's places for us to go, places for us to exercise and free our minds and improve our mental health. It's also spaces where we can improve. I'm going to go on to this in a bit, but wetland areas have an incredible capacity to solve other problems as well, such as carbon storage, and I started off by talking about the carbon problem, and also flood management, and obviously providing a home for wildlife and for us. So that's the idea of that. Nature-based solutions are actually looking at how nature can start to solve some of the problems that we have today. Now, in that strategy, the government is talking about wanting to have 500,000 hectares of more green and blue spaces. That's a lot of land. And amongst that 500,000 hectares is 100,000 hectares of new and reinstated wetlands. I'm going to come on and talk about Steert, which I've already mentioned in a little bit, because the Steert story for us has shown us what wetlands are capable in terms of carbon storage, diversification of nature, and providing a good place for people to visit. But that site is under 500 hectares. So we're talking about 100,000 hectares. We have experience with a 500 hectare site. That's the biggest site we've worked with. We are the world leaders in this stuff. So you start to see that we are looking at something that's a big challenge, but that's what the government want to do, and we want to be leading with that. So we want to bring partners together to do that. And the multi-benefit of blue infrastructure, I'm not going to go into that actually, but I've already talked about, if you still restore wetlands, and you start to restore the solutions to some of the problems we're facing. So that 100,000 hectares, we want a strategic approach. I've mentioned that Steert is just 488 hectares. We've done little bits of work with other things around Gloucestershire. Some of you may know that we've been working on urban drainage systems and rural water storage systems. So this is really using how we use water in urban areas to improve habitats and reduce runoff. Now, one of our difficulties in urban areas is that we all want hard surfaces. It's been, I think that's changing slightly now, but there was certainly, and I blame Ground Force partly, the TV programme, getting rid of soft surface gardens and instead replacing them with hard surface gardens, lots of tarmac, places to park the car, tons of runoff, which create huge problems in urban areas. And I was one of the people who suffered in the floods of 2007, and I know what that feels like. And I'll come on later on and explain just how much the whole world, and our government in particular, is expecting the problems and the costs of flooding to increase as the climate warms. So we need a strategic approach so that we get lots of people and governments and partners together and businesses, so that rather than working on small areas like Steert, we can look at big areas of wetland restoration so that we can actually start to tackle some of these things on a bigger scale. I'm going to talk about the carbon flooding, well-being, water quality stuff in a little bit more detail as I go through. And I've already mentioned about partnerships. So this is, we can't do this on our own. We are an organisation of around 500 staff and around 1,000 volunteers. And that's 500 staff and 1,000 volunteers across all 10 sites in the UK and 2 international sites. So you can see we're small. I ran a bigger team of that filling potholes in Gloucestershire. So you can see that we are too small to tackle this on our own. But as I said earlier, we have an incredible legacy from Peter Scott and other researchers, you know, since and before him, since him and with him in the trust. But we also have an incredible reputation, which makes it possible for us to bat above our weight, really. So why wetlands? Well, I've covered a bit of this already. So certain types of wetlands store more carbon than others. It's worth mentioning that the UK has 12% of the world's salt marsh. Now, salt marsh is a particular kind of wetland. It's around the coast. If you think in your mind, I'll show you a picture. Actually, I'll skip forward. Picture of the UK. There you go. If you look at without Ireland, sorry. If you look at our coastline, what we've got is a very jaggedy coastline. And in amongst that coastline, we've got quite a lot of salt marsh. And this is areas where tidal estuaries overflow onto the land and create this kind of odd, semi-salty, very salty at times, very wet and very non-saline at other times habitat, which is very particular to certain species of bird, insect and plant life. But those salt marshes are also really, really important areas for storing carbon. Now, if we have 12% of the world's salt marsh, and that's one of the best areas for storing carbon, I'll come on to peat bogs in a minute, and we've lost 90% of our wetlands in total, and a third of those we've lost in the last 50 years, you can start to see that although we've got a big percentage of the world's salt marsh, that amount worldwide is still tiny. We still have all those lovely estuaries. We have the capacity to increase the number of salt marshes. And I'll say more when I talk about Steert, about how that works. I'll go back actually to the other picture, but so, you know, it's not every wetland is as good at storing carbon as others. So we're talking about carbon storage. There are some that are better than others. In terms of improving well-being, I was talking to one of our researchers pre-COVID, actually, when I was trying to do some work with local surgeries around Slimbridge to say, bring people to if people have got mental health problems and you think as a doctor that a day out with wildlife at Slimbridge would be a benefit to them, give them a free ticket. And we issued free tickets to 5 surgeries around Slimbridge. And I was working with one of our researchers who was doing some similar work in London, but in much more detail, and they were really researching the effects of this. And Jono said to me, one of the amazing things, and we're still verifying this even after all this time, is they put sensors on volunteers who came to London Wetlands Centre to test their stress levels, is it cortisol, sweat levels and temperature, when they arrived at London Wetlands Centre, and see how fast all of those would decline once they started visiting. And then they did the same tests on people visiting other countryside sites. And what they found was that people visiting wetlands, those effects on reducing their cortisol, their stress levels, their sweat levels and their temperatures was much more marked for people visiting a wetland than other sites. Now, these are relatively small numbers of participants, and we will continue to do this research. We're working with Exeter University on this. But what we know is, from that, which we've still got to verify, is we're getting much more confident about the actual effects of wetlands on our physiology, you know, in a very rapid way. You know, this is not something you have to do every day forever. You can feel much better quite quickly just from a visit. So, and it doesn't have to be, you know, WWT site, the pond in the village, the garden pond, reducing flooding. One of the amazing things about wetlands, because we kind of think, well, wetlands are wet, aren't they? But wetlands actually are often very dry, and during downpours, they are one of the most effective things at holding on to water. So I've said already about having hard surfaces in gardens and in urban areas causes a really massive runoff of water. So we can actually put in more wetlands, even small wetlands in people's gardens, and we reduce that runoff of water. And that reduced runoff of water has a massive impact on flooding. It also, of course, has the opposite effect, which is it stores water during times of drought. So in terms of that balance of drought and flood, you can't really get anything better than a natural wetland or a man-made one. I'll go for either of those because it's very good at doing both. And the last one is that whole restoring biodiversity. It says up there, nature is in free fall. Chris Packham, I saw him on television the other day, and he was saying that he doesn't think we've now got a climate. We've got a global warming. We've got global crisis with our global warming, and there are lots of people who would agree with him on that. I put this in just to show, I've talked a lot about the number of wetlands and how they've declined in the UK, but that just shows you that. So the first picture is about 1700. Interestingly, you can see Fenland there, that really, really purple area, hugely drained down, sugar beet and potatoes. Sugar beet and potatoes, the land of sugar beet and potatoes, black earth. The land is much lower than the actual water level, and it's endlessly pumped to keep it that way. We run a tiny site at Steert. Some of you might have been there, but we need to start restoring some of these sites. And if we can't restore them where we used to have wetlands, we've got to find a way to increase the number of wetlands elsewhere on sites that it is possible to introduce wetland sites. And we're doing loads of research on that at the moment. But I think that kind of gives you an idea of just how depleted our 90% fall in wetlands, what it looks like. So the left-hand image was 1700, and the right-hand image is essentially right now. Yeah, it's depressing. Well, I should say it's depressing. One of the things I love about WWT, we are endlessly optimistic about the possibilities for change. And I think the reason you're all here, I'm assuming, is because you are also optimistic about the possibilities of change, because otherwise why would we even bother? So, Steert. I've mentioned Steert several times. It's worth saying a little bit about Steert Marshes. Anybody been to Steert Marshes? Excellent, a few of you. So this was essentially sort of early 2000s. Steert is on the North Somerset coast, an area that flooded regularly. The River Severn has got the second highest tidal range in the world, next to the Bay of Fundy in Canada. But as the oceans expand ever so slightly as they warm, because warm things get bigger, don't they? Like, gases expand and liquids expand. Oceans are expanding imperceptibly, except that we are noticing it with higher tides and greater floods of tidal ranges. And at Steert, the Environment Agency was really concerned that housing actually around Steert would start to flood. Housing and farm houses would start to flood. So they wanted to introduce some kind of flood defence, started talking to us, and we were saying, well, you know what, it would be really possible here to build some big channels that should flood as the tide comes in, so they take some of that water, and then the area around it on the really big tides, and we all know, the Severn bore type, there's 2 bores a day, but those really big bore tides, could flood the area around it, and that would produce a lateral wetland kind of every day as the tide comes in and out, but also wider wetlands on those bigger floods. And we could actually see what those wetlands turn into and how they evolve, because it would be a really wonderful way to research a natural wetland sort of reinstating itself, and also that would save all those houses from flooding. Steert actually was a 488 hectare project. It's now part of a massive, I can't even remember what it's called now, but it's a massive nature area in Somerset, which includes all the hills around it that feeds into Steert, and we've got work to sort of slow down flow levels, remove phosphorus and all kinds of stuff by doing different works on the water that feeds into Steert, not just from the River Severn but from the hills around it. But the amazing thing about Steert, which I don't think we were really expecting this. We thought that Steert would become a wonderful place for wildlife. And I was talking to Alice, who runs that site, and she did a bio blitz about 2 years ago, where they actually looked over a space of a week how many species their volunteers and staff could identify in a week. And I think it was 542. I've put up there put 550, but I have a feeling it was 542 species. And that's plants, bugs, bees, insects, butterflies, squiddy things, you know, shrimps, birds, everything you can think of. But then that relatively small area at Steert. So that was amazing. It did provide the coastal flood defences that the Environment Agency was hoping for. It has provided an enormous community asset. We have around 25,000 people a year visit Steert. It's a no-pay entry at Steert, which is really unusual for us. We do have gated, pay points at all of our sites except Steert. But the most amazing thing about Steert is that it started to produce salt marsh, which we knew it would, but we didn't know really what that would mean in terms of carbon storage. Now, you don't tend to create salt marsh. In fact, if anything, salt marsh has been depleting like all the other habitats, water habitats. But with Steert, us building it from scratch really, Manchester University were really keen to do some research to see what the impacts of that would be and how would this change over time. So they've been working there ever since we first flooded that channel in 2014. I was speaking to one of the researchers who's made this her kind of life's work, her thesis, doctorate and everything, and she was saying that in the first 4 years of Steert opening, the amount of carbon stored there was the equivalent of 10 million saplings growing for 2 years. I'll say that again. The carbon from 10 million saplings, that's a lot of saplings, growing for 2 years. So the carbon storage on salt marsh is at least 3 times as fast and as effective as forests. Now, you are not hearing me say we shouldn't have forests, because forests wouldn't grow there. This is not a site that's good for forests. But it did start to show us that salt marsh could be a very effective way of us starting to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. If we can't address all the ways in which it goes into the atmosphere, and gas heating at home is one of the biggest issues, then we have to increase the way we suck it back out. The great thing about this way of storing carbon is that the way it works, actually I've got a this is one of my slides that I pinched from somewhere else. So you don't have to read the words really, but what it's saying is that plants drawing carbon from the air, and then they store it in their greenness, in the body of the plants. And then when those big tides come, they chuck a whole lot of mud on top of that. And that mud stays there. So all the carbon in those plants basically gets held in that mud forever. Because when the Severn floods at Steert, it floods, chucks a whole lot of mud, and then it gradually withdraws very slowly, and all the mud stays there. So gradually the land builds up, but all the carbon in all the shrimps and animals and plants and roots and everything else gets stored in that area forever. The other thing about trees is they fall down and rot or get burned at some point. Very few of them end up going into kind of coal seams. That's the Carboniferous age. But this stays there forever, and it's the same effect from peat bogs, with all that plant life gradually squishing down, getting covered over and holding on to that carbon forever. So we know that this is, certainly in the UK, the most effective per hectare way of storing carbon. Who knew? Thank goodness for steered, because what that is doing, and I've got some really good news a bit later on that I'll share with you, what that's doing is telling us that we've got now a lever to bring money in from business, and we've started to do that on quite a big scale. A few smaller things, a few other things to mention. I've mentioned about flood protection. So 1 in 6 homes and over 500 major infrastructure assets. And those are things like power stations and motorways and airports and hospitals. A lot of assets are now vulnerable to flooding. As I said, I was one of the people who flooded in the big floods of 2007 in Gloucestershire, but you know, there have been other floods in Gloucestershire since then. And in 2015-16, we know that the cost to the economy was probably just under £2 billion for the cost of flooding. That is actually higher than the amount of money that goes into trying to prevent flooding. So wetlands can help reduce flooding because they hold on to that water. And I've got a lovely little image that this is kind of what we've been doing at Steert. And I'm sorry it's quite a small picture, but I had to pinch it out of one of our magazines. So essentially there's lots of low cost ways you can do that. So if you look at that, we've been working around Steert. It says on there, horizontal ploughing helps retain water. Now I come from a farming family, and it's always much easier to plough up and down a slope. And what you do with that is you create, you know, 87 natural drainage channels that throw all the water when it rains straight down to the bottom of the hill. So we're working with farmers to say, can we plough across the gradient? Because each one of those plough lines will then hold water. Simple. Makes ploughing a little bit more difficult, although depending on what the terrain is. So, then we're looking at peat bogs soaking up water. We're looking at cattle grazing in lower densities. So the more foliage, you know, grassland, that is, if it gets chewed really short, cattle don't particularly like really short grass anyway, but that increases the runoff. So if we farm them in lower densities, we reduce the runoff. We've got other things in there like floodplain store and slow release stormwater. So this is really the idea of having areas that can flood. We know Gloucestershire has got masses of floodplain, which we are building on. And that's a different argument, I suppose, really, because planning, you know, people need homes, but we have to find a way to retain our floodplains. My home in Longford, just outside Gloucester, flooded because we've built on the floodplain. My house was on the floodplain. I didn't know that when I bought it. And we've got other bankside alders, so this is the right kind of vegetation. And one of the things that we're doing is, have you heard of the expression leaky dams? Yeah, so leaky dams are basically, you know, instead of having clear waterways, streams or whatever it might be, actually put in obstacles to that, because nature would do that anyway. I always think of it as the human beaver project. So, you know, beavers have you know, lots of places are now reintroducing beaver, and we've got them in Gloucestershire as well. But that idea that you just halt the flow of water a bit so that it doesn't all end up in the drainage system at the same time and get completely overwhelmed. We've been doing some other, I think this one is in Somerset, where we're just putting up, working with landowners to say, well, this is a really great area that we could put in a pond. It's a natural area where water flows anyway. A simple dam can actually hold an awful lot of water, and that then creates a habitat. It keeps the rest of your land better drained, at the same time as creating you know, a biodiversity solution and a drainage system. Oh, I knew I must have a picture of leaky dams in there somewhere. So the other thing about having slow filtration, that you know, rather than having water run off really quickly, it actually helps to improve water quality. So we know that by actually slowly filtering runoff water, that we can take out all kinds of chemicals and nutrients that are often put in for farming, but that can help to extract it. The other thing is that we're increasingly aware of the ability of man-made wetlands to process toxins out of the water. We know that if, you know, sewage gets processed very thoroughly, but the last stages of sewage, if it goes through a wetland, it actually cleans it up even better. We sort of get semi-clean water and then put it through a wetland, because wetland plants take out all those nasty nutrients, so it becomes clean afterwards. And in fact, Slimbridge do that. All of our effluent on site is actually processed entirely naturally by our reed beds. So, you know, all of these things are possible. I said I would show you a little slide about how we can do better in our urban areas. So we know that the blue environment can be as good or even better for you than a green one. I've already mentioned that in some of the work that Jono's done in London, looking at how cortisol levels and other things fall when you're in a wetland. But the other thing is in urban areas, that we've got a much greater opportunity to store water in urban areas. This is a bit of a bugbear for me personally, because I see, you know, people filling in their garden ponds. I see lots of runoff, hard surfaces, whereas actually garden ponds, I knew I was going to get this in, is the single most important thing that any of us can individually do for wildlife. Not just water life, but wildlife, because everything drinks water. So if you've got a garden pond, you know, all wildlife around your garden pond is going to improve, and it will provide you with something which is a thing of pure joy. I can't tell you how excited I get when the frog spawn first comes. This year it was on February the 16th, which was amazing, because last year it was March the 16th. So I'm hoping we're going to, I mean, I don't know whether that's an indication of climate, who knows? But it's always an exciting time, and then watching that progress through the year. But, you know, newts and all the rest of it, it's an amazing thing. So it's good for me, and I'm sure it would be good for other people too. But we've got lots of opportunity to store water and release it more slowly in urban areas. Green roofs. Some countries absolutely have green roofs. It's part of their culture. We very rarely have green roofs. I don't have one at home yet, but it was the next thing I'm going to try. One of the things I've got at home is, lots of us I'm sure have got water butts, but I have effectively similar to a water butt, but as the water runs off my conservatory roof, I run it through a small pond, and then when that overflows, it runs into my garden beds. And that slows down such a lot of the water that would naturally go into the drainage system. It could, in any other house, it would either plop straight off my conservatory roof, go into a water butt, and when that overflows, go into the drain. But in mine, very little of it goes into the drain, because it's just filtered out to use it in different ways. We can also you can see on this picture, you know, there's ideas of having sort of wet areas around urban areas, places where you can actually enjoy it, go fishing, you know, boating, whatever it is. You know, water provides us with an incredible asset for physical and mental health. I've got to confess, I know very little about the science of this, about how water is, how wetlands treat water, but I know that there is loads of evidence that wetlands are really good at cleaning water. But what we've got is lots of ad hoc small attempts at doing this at the moment. I know that breweries, for example, there are a number of breweries that use wetlands in order to process their waste products before it goes into the water system. I know that some vets practices do it, because some of the waste from vets practices run into the, you know, they'd either have to remove it or they can process it through a mini wetland and then it can go into the water system. But there are lots of ways in which we can do that. And if we can do that, then that problem of only 16% of our water overall and only 14% of our rivers are in good condition, that's pretty scary. You know, I'm from the Forest of Dean. The River Wye is the most beautiful river and one of the most polluted in the country. It's extraordinary that we've managed to get into that position, but only 14% of our rivers are in good ecological status, and that's not my data, that's the Environment Agency's. And I suppose, just sort of starting to wrap up really, is our approach is, I sort of started by saying this, is to try and be as statistically factual as we can possibly be. We want to do the research, we want to be able to provide the evidence, and I think STEERT has given us some of that evidence around carbon storage. The government's own work has given us that evidence around effects on our health. We know that some of the things that we're using as tools to store water and reduce flood water are working, and we know that all habitats, not just wetlands, are being destroyed, and that all the wildlife that lives on those is being destroyed with it. But what we do is use our evidence to try and get people on board with that. Opportunity mapping, another bit of jargon, but what we're doing currently is looking at sites all over the UK that might be a possibility for the reintroduction or reinstatement of wetlands, particularly with that focus on salt marshes. And that demonstration site, it says 480 hectares up there. It's actually 488 hectares at STEERT. That is providing us with a massive amount of data in order to get governments on board. And I'm really pleased to be able to say that we've now got a partnership. Our Blue Recovery Leaders Group has got all of these partners on board. So some quite big, the Crown Estate, National Grid, Severn Trent, People's Postcode Lottery. These are some really big partners. They're chief execs working with us to see how they can be part of the solution with us. And I said I had a bit of lovely news. Aviva run our pension scheme at WWT. So we've been working with Aviva to say, if you invest in wetlands, you'll be part of the solution for the future. So we're now in contract with Aviva, that I think it's £20 million, it's a lot of money, sorry, £21 million for this 10-year piece of work to try and rebuild some of our wetlands, to work on some of the experiences that we've had at STEERT, and really use salt marsh as a way to unlock potential in terms of locking up carbon. So I didn't actually refer to my notes at all, so I'm quite pleased about that. But that was where I wanted to end it, really, was to say that Blue Recovery is about recovering from the environmental crisis, our health crisis, our flooding crisis, and our loss of habitat crisis, and the effects that that has on biodiversity. But the recovery bit is really possible. And I think as an organisation, we're always positive about that, and our history for the last 77 years has shown that actually we've got good reason to be optimistic because we get things done, and we're now really starting to draw in some big partners to be behind us on that. So that's it from me, but I will answer questions if I can, but bearing in mind this is not my area of work. I've swatted up to do this today for you, so I'll answer whatever I can. Thank you. Thank you.
What kind of things can we do locally that could help?
Yeah, so number one is build ponds. My own community, we're actually going to put a pond in our local park. Putting in mini wetlands, you can do that in your garden, you can do it in your community. I think be part of the voice for wetlands. And not just wetlands, but any habitat. But there's much more opportunity now, I think more than ever before, to petition for things. I don't know about you, but I see many more petitions coming through on environmental issues. And is it if you get 100,000 votes, it has to be debated in Parliament. If you get 10,000 people voted, it has to go forward to another level of... So, I don't feel as powerless as I used to feel because there are opportunities now to say, actually, I feel very strongly that this isn't good enough. The government has made a commitment to have an environment which is in better condition than it was when they took on. So actually, where's the evidence of that? So I feel much more able to do that. I think local MPs, we have a voice, and I think sometimes we forget that we've got that. And join an environmental organisation. It doesn't have to be ours. I would love if it was ours, but it doesn't have to be us. Because whilst wetlands is part of the solution, all habitats come together to make the full solution. We work very closely with National Trust, with our SPB, with the Wildlife Trusts. We're all in it together, aren't we? So noses in the same direction. And don't let our differences divide us in terms of what we're trying to do for the environment. Does that answer your question? I think feel empowered.
Anyone else?
I'm just interested how if you've identified that we need another 40 sturts, if I've got the maths truly right. I mean, where you've got this mapping exercise, what are the obstacles? Who owns the current property? And
so
is that the obstacle? Was it
so I mean, bearing in mind we're just doing this mapping exercise at the moment, so we've got some pretty large areas with landowners in Scotland. That won't be a big surprise, I guess, because that's where we've got wild areas as well. We're looking at areas that would benefit from flood defences that would involve building salt marsh, which is exactly what happened at Steart. We're not only looking at salt marsh, so salt marsh is a big part of the solution because it holds carbon so well, but we're looking at other ways in which we can restore wetlands as well. So it's not just 100,000 hectares of salt marsh, it's 100,000 hectares of existing wetlands as well, which is become dilapidated. So, you know, wetlands become filled up with phosphates, they come silted up. One of the things that we do at all of our sites, and I think people forget this, at Slimbridge, I volunteer on the team that look after the wetland reserve at Slimbridge, and I can tell you there isn't a blade of grass that isn't managed, because when you have very few wetlands and you're a custodian of them, some of them, it's really important that you keep them as pristine as possible for all the species that need to use it. So part of what we want to do is work with other landowners to restore the quality of the wetlands that they already have. So it's a real combination, and honestly I don't know what proportion is likely to be new and which is likely to be repaired.
You owned Steart originally, was that?
So Steart was farmland that had become, I think I've got this right, that had become salinated, basically. So it was really cheap to buy. I think that was the story at Steart. Similar story actually at Martin Mere. When we bought our site at Martin Mere, that was farmland that had become so depleted, nutrient depleted from being over farmed, that we bought it really cheap and reinstated some of the mere. So, you know, we've got £20 million is a lot of money, 21 million, but it's not enough to solve the problem. It's enough for us to do the next step. And Aviva want a lot out of us for that, not surprisingly. But then so do we. We're incredibly ambitious.
What's the difference between a salinated land and a salt marsh, isn't it?
So it's the same, really. So salt marsh is an area which is subject to flooding in an estuarine area. And estuaries are sort of semi-salty, you know, they're mixed up with the sea. And because you get this incredible mixing of salty and fresh water, it's an entirely unique habitat. Because also, once it's finished flooding, through the summer, when it gets rained on, it's entirely fresh water. So it's a really, really odd habitat, but it's that kind of rich diversity of things you don't get elsewhere, combined with that ability to store carbon under all that mud. Yeah. We've got some really, if you want to come to Slimbridge, we've got some really nice explanations of how that works there on the estuary. Come to Slimbridge anyway. Steart is 488 hectares. I think the whole of Slimbridge, and that includes the reserve, is 380 hectares. So Steart is, because the site, the main centre at Slimbridge, I think, is 50 hectares, I think, something like that. It's quite, you know, and then the whole reserve area around that is 300 and something odd. So Steart is bigger than Slimbridge, which is one of our bigger sites. We've got bigger sites in Scotland and Walney. But if I pinpointed Steart on that map, it's really small, but big. It is a landscape, but you know. Well, can I say thank you? Thank you for listening. Thank you for inviting me along. I hope, if I haven't inspired you, I hope I've educated you a little bit. But feel inspired, because you know what? Now is our time. I really do think now is the time for us to stop being passive about the things that are really upsetting us and start to say, I expect and want change because you've promised it. So I'm not going to get any more political than that, but I hope I've left you with a sense of what's possible. and that it isn't all hopeless. Thank you.